Hi, Peter, Dr. Peter. Welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you here today. I've been familiar with your work for a while. I think it's interesting and important and excited to discuss it. So I want to just jump right in with a question about science versus philosophy. And I don't know if you get this often. My feeling is that the philosophical world often feels sort of like outstripped by the scientific community. And, science can point, maybe I'm wrong, science can point to stuff like, we made the MRI machine, we did the Apollo missions, like we invented anti-malarial medicines. Like the question I'd like to ask you is, what do you see as the main contemporary contribution of philosophy?
Um, I suppose it is like that sometimes. I should first of all say thanks a lot for having me, Adam. A pleasure to be here.
My
Yeah, with
pleasure.
regard to philosophy and science, um, I think that you can see it as competitive in a way, but of course, I see science as a subset of philosophy. So until the 1830s or so, what we now call science was called natural philosophy. So one of the great local philosophers here, or local scientists, was Sir Humphrey Davy, whose statue stands about 7 miles from here. He called himself a chemical philosopher, but today we'd call him a chemist.
Right.
So, in one sense, I think that science and philosophy are, well, part of one thing, really, the quest for knowledge, or something like that. Um, Now, whereas science does, people search for answers in science, I suppose, and you see the sort of science says and scientists as a kind of new priesthood, and philosophy seems very abstract and kind of maybe elitist in some kind of ivory tower and so on. But the important thing is, I mean, I consider myself a philosopher of mind first and foremost, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that science as a methodology has been very successful, but as an ontology, as a theory of what exists, the very method itself, I think, excludes notions of mind consciousness in its very workings. So I think philosophy can be a corrective of that, a critic, as it were, to say that, listen, you're not going to discover. There's a certain remit of science, and beyond that, you'd have to change what we mean by science to move forward.
So just to
So
clarify,
yeah,
are you saying that the scientific method prevents the discovery of ultimate reality or of our understanding
yeah,
of consciousness?
yeah, to a certain extent, because with Galileo and Descartes and Francis Bacon, people like that, there was a division of reality into the physical and the mental in the 17th century, through Descartes especially, and it was seen that the mental was the ambit of religion, the soul, and so on, and external reality, as it were, which was kind of abstracted from any notions of mind and whatever, was the ambit of science. And thus, with this substance dualism of philosophy, in other words, mind and matter as two separate realms, as it were, which perhaps interacted in the pineal gland, as Descartes said, with that substance dualism in philosophy and science, you had sort of parallel bifurcation of culture into religion and science. And I think this bifurcation is an error. I mean, before that, R.G. Collingwood, a great British philosopher, he said that before the 17th century, mind existed within nature. From the Aristotelian tradition, from the Greek tradition, really. Um, and this is something we've lost. So when you see reality as purely mechanical, physical, spatio-temporal only, and along with certain properties, new properties of matter, um, you get to this cul-de-sac, which is the hard problem of consciousness. How do you get mind from matter? And of course, we've come to that cul-de-sac because the methodology of science has excluded mind in the first place. So that's why it's an empirical method. You can only talk about what you can perceive, and of course, with regard to the mind, you can't. There's the whole problem of other minds. You can't perceive another person's mind. You can't become it. You can infer it. You can predict what a person's thinking or seeing or whatever, but you can't actually become that person to get their perspective. And so that So when it comes to the mind, one has to look into metaphysics rather than physics. In other words, one has to realize that physics has this empirical methodology ingrained within its very essence, and that's what I mean by the limitations of science to a certain extent, uh,
Yeah,
regardless of its technological prowess.
right.
It still is, in my view, limited.
So you wrote for us on h.com/philosophy, which I recommend people go to, a great article on consciousness and psychedelics. And in its opening, you list 11 different theories by my count of what consciousness is. And, this consciousness thing that people struggle with is famously called, at this point, the hard problem of consciousness. So, my question for you is what makes it so hard? Why has it been such a conundrum for so long? And in your view, has there been, again, any tangible progress made in the last number of years of our understanding of it?
Well, to start with the last point, I think the progress made is a general appreciation of the nature of the problem. I mean, the hard problem of consciousness was coined by David Chalmers in 1995. Well, it was published in that year. But before that, it was called the explanatory gap, the mind matter, or the mind body mystery, and so on and so forth. So this has been a long problem in philosophy. But the interesting thing about the term the hard problem of consciousness is that it was a term that became well known because it reached a point at the end of the 20th century where all of the current theories of consciousness had really come to an end. They sort of just didn't work out. So you had like psychoneural identity theory, that mind was identical to the brain, resulted in a number of paradoxes. You had behaviorism, logical behaviorism, which is that the mental state is merely behavior, bodily behavior, like happiness is smiling, for example. That led to a number
Right.
of paradoxes. You had eliminative materialism, which is that mind simply doesn't exist, so it's not a problem, and a number of others, functionalism and so on. Um, all of these came to yeah, like a dead end, and so this old problem in philosophy, it's been a problem for thousands of years, really, suddenly became emphasized, I suppose, and scientists now, most scientists agree that it is a major problem. But I mean, it's such a big problem that people don't even know which science is the suitable one in which to potentially solve it. A lot of people think neuroscience, but I mean that presupposes that the mind is, or rather, the brain is a necessary and sufficient condition for the mind, which has not been cannot be proved for empirical reasons, as we discussed. I mean, for example, plants might have basic forms of sentience, as the ancient Greeks believed. Of course, this then wouldn't be the remit of neuroscience. There may be forms of consciousness of which we're completely unaware. There might be machines, may be sentient, like as was in the news recently with this Google thing. So, and that, of course, that wouldn't be the remit of neuroscience either. But so we don't even know which science is most appropriate. My own view is that none of them are. Or rather all of them are. It sort of covers all of these different sciences and shouldn't be doesn't belong to any particular one of them. This is kind of what the philosophy of mind is more of an overview of different options. So that's progress is negative. Like, we've realized there's a big problem. I mean, we've culturally realized it. A lot of people think it's obvious, or we know the problem is not even a problem, or we've solved it. But you get no major agreement on that at all. Different theories, just to list them very quickly. Well, I've listed some. So the mind is the brain, or the mind doesn't exist, or the dualism that I mentioned, mind and brain are separate substances, or we've got neutral monism, which is the mind and body both emerge from something that is beneath both of them, as it were. There's the belief in panpsychism, which I did my PhD on, which is the view that mind exists in all entities, like not just animals, but also plants, even down to molecules and so on. And well, the jury's out. There's just no agreement at the moment. There's just a lot of new theories and a lot of returning to old theories. So panpsychism, for example, was very popular a few hundred years ago with people like Spinoza and Leibniz, and because of the cul-de-sac, the hard problem of consciousness, we've returned to these old theorists to see if they can offer us something new once again. But that's what makes it all very exciting, I think. We just don't know. We don't even know what a lot of people don't even accept the problem. They just can't get their head around the problem. It's just like conceptually bizarre for them. So certain scientists I've spoken to, they just cannot understand what it means, this problem, or why it's a problem. So
My personal observation is that people seem somewhat taken aback at the difficulty of it. I think that there seems to have been some expectation that, decades ago or even longer, that it would be figured out by now. And I think the fact that it became harder as opposed to easier is surprising in some regard. And I think that it's also true in certain aspects of biology. Like our comprehension of the universe seems to become more and more complex as opposed to more and more simple as time goes on, which I think is counterintuitive. But okay, so be that as it may, one of the other things that you write about and speak about is something called psychedelic consciousness. And in the article that I referenced before, I just want to quote you for 1 second because I think it's very fascinating. You say, "We cannot judge what is hallucinatory if we do not know what is real. Thus, the hard problem of consciousness bears directly upon the hard problem of psychedelic consciousness, the problem of determining the truth or delusion of certain psychedelic experiences." So my first question on that is to ask you, is it fair to say that we are equally as ignorant, let's call it, about the hard problem of consciousness as we are about psychedelic consciousness? Are we any closer with psychedelic consciousness to any other form of it?
Well, yeah, I think they're intimately conjoined, these two questions. And I mean, in the context of that essay, what I meant was that there are certain, I wouldn't say common, but certain reports of psychedelic experiences that are, for example, timeless. They're outside of time, as opposed to instantaneous. They're outside of time. They're spaceless, or they are contain more forms of space, more dimensions of space, and and there are feelings of unity with nature and unity with reality and so on. They're quite almost platitudes now. They're so common.
Right.
Now, the prevailing, well, Jae-Kwon Kim, a great philosopher of mind who died a couple of years ago, he said the prevailing view of the neuroscience, really, or cognitive science, was that of emergentism, that all of mind emerges from the brain. We don't know how that happens. That's another part of the hard problem, but that's the assumption, as opposed to being the brain, the psychoneural identity theory. He says that's the word, but you see, under that model, experiences like timelessness or nature connectedness and so on would have to be then epiphenomena of the brain. In other words, hallucinations. And of course, you get that in the very term hallucinogen, as opposed to psychedelic. Psychedelic means mind manifesting. It's a bit more neutral. So there's this view that under that ultimately is a metaphysical point of view, physicalism or emergentism as a type of physicalism. Slow me down if I'm using too many isms here. Right?
Okay.
But under this metaphysical view, which happens to be the prevailing view of science today, still metaphysics though, is not in itself scientific. There are no scientific laws that bridge matter and mind, you see. Under that metaphysic, certain experiences such as timelessness and whatever would have to be then epiphenomena, in other words, illusions, hallucinations. However, if one goes back, as it were, and changes the underlying metaphysic, for example, to something like maybe Spinoza's metaphysics, which is the view that very basically mind and matter are the same thing seen from two different perspectives, and that same thing, that one substance, thus he's a monist, he calls God or nature. Under that metaphysical point of view, for Spinoza, time is really just our way of seeing our expression of this one ultimate substance. So in reality, time is not real. Time is not part of reality. It's, as it were, itself an emergent property of reality. So if one assumes that instead of, let's say, emergentism, physicalist emergentism, and then one has an experience of timelessness, I think one is more, or at least one is more open-minded to see it not necessarily as a delusion or a hallucination, but as possibly, not definitely, possibly a veridical perception. In other words, a real perception. At least the metaphysics changes the possibilities of hallucination as opposed to veridicality, objective reality.
Right. And to tell you the truth, this is where my interest really lies. With this subject and with the subjects like near-death experiences, because they all seem and of course theology all seem to point towards this very central concepts of unity, love, joy. There are certain hallmarks that seem to be in common with all these kinds of experiences, and they're consistent with at least my understanding of the nature of quote unquote spiritual reality. And so, what's enticing for a person like me is that these aspects of philosophy and aspects of even science, are hinting towards this reality, which I assume for different reasons is a true reality. And so it seems to me that more and more people, and I hope that this is true, are opening to the idea that at the core of everything are these sort of fundamental principles. And it furthermore seems to me that everybody is seeking these things, either consciously or subconsciously. Everyone is looking for love. Everyone is looking for unity in some form or another, and are unhappy naturally when they don't have it. And so the psychedelic experience is inherently fascinating to me, and I think to millions of people. So that's just an observation, and therefore I think your work is very valuable.
Thank you. I mean, I think the interesting thing about psychedelics now is they came out and, there was a psychedelic interest in the 1960s, of course, which was suppressed pretty quickly. And when that came out in philosophy of mind, you had very reductivist theories of consciousness. Like I said, it doesn't exist or is identical to the brain or something like this. And so psychedelic consciousness was sort of ignored, really, in the university at least. And then it was criminalized. And this is partly why you get now this reputation of psychedelics being criminal or merely recreational or of no intellectual import. But of course, before the 60s, you had great thinkers, psychologists, philosophers, scientists, exploring these states of mind. Like I mentioned Humphrey Davy, for example, who took 200 pints of nitrous oxide in 1799. You had the great psychologist and philosopher William James, who was the first really to bring together psychedelic consciousness with mystical consciousness, in, like, for example, varieties of religious experience in 1902. Other philosophers as well, like H.H. Price, Gerald Hurd, people like that.
Aldous Huxley.
Aldous Huxley, yeah. So there was a deep intellectual interest in these until, the 1960s, the 1970 Act sort of changed things, But it's returning now, and I think coming back to your point, I'm speaking from Britain here, and I'm half Swedish, and they're both very secular countries. And okay, we got the Church of England here, but it's dying, really. It's running out of money, and but yet people are not satisfied with a kind of general metaphysical view that is physicalism. I mean, the way it's taught here, I went to school here in England and Sweden. It's not taught like this is what we believe in physicalism. It was just the underlying metaphysic, it's unquestioned, and that's how it instills itself. This ideology instills itself, But I think it's very unsatisfying towards people because it essentially says nature is dead. And we're just extremely lucky exceptions to the whole of nature, that have now, only humans have consciousness, or that's what Descartes thought, or at least only the mammals, or something like this. I think it's deeply unsatisfying. It's also dangerous from an ecological point of view to think that nature is just merely dead and the only thing of intrinsic value and worth is us, so therefore we can sort of exploit nature to our ends because our ends are the only valuable ones. And also I think it just leads to depression. There's just no meaning. There's just no meaning in life. There's no value in life. Even Arthur Schopenhauer, who was an atheist, quite a hardcore atheist who influenced Nietzsche, he said that man has a metaphysical desire. And he was a metaphysician, of course, following Kant, and I think that's true. Now, of course, metaphysics for most people is kind of like I don't know why, but it can appear sort of dry and and dull. It doesn't appeal to a lot of people. I think that's because of the way it's taught, really. But psychedelics offer people metaphysical experiences rather than metaphysical theories. Not just metaphysical experiences, also just like aesthetic ones, or ones to do with seeing the ancestors in different cultures. And so, I mean, there are many different. There's an array of psychedelic experiences, but one of them fits nicely into what we call metaphysics here. Like timelessness, like I mentioned. And so suddenly, from this kind of dead world physicalism in which we're all sort of brought up, I speak from Europe here, suddenly there's like, wow, there's an experience of something else, something much more important. This, by the way, seems to be the main mechanism of psychedelic therapy now, which is becoming a huge industry in itself. That suddenly, for example, I know people in Exeter University working on ketamine for alcohol abuse. So the mechanism of action, ketamine in high enough doses I consider psychedelic. In high enough doses, you get this big view of reality, the grand picture, as it were. Everything is alive, everything has value, everything is unified. You are part of that, and as a result of that, it seems that people's personal problems, for which they were drinking alcohol to mask, suddenly appear trivial, or at least not as important as they once did. And thus there's a therapeutic value in that. In other words, it's a metaphysical experience that seems to be having therapeutic results. And that's why, I mean, my sort of mission at the moment is to say that, more metaphysics, more philosophy really needs to be put into so-called psychedelic integration, because at the moment it's just being done by psychiatrists and psychologists who have no training in metaphysics at all, and of course have a slight physicalist bias in my experience. So
Yeah. So
yeah,
did you see the film by any chance, Fantastic Fungi? Which is about, partially it's about just mushrooms and the nature of mushrooms and fungus, in general, but also they go into the psychedelic aspects. And
I
you
haven't
haven't,
seen it yet, but it's on my list.
it's really, really well done. And, but they show cancer patients who are undergoing psychedelic treatment for their fear of dying, essentially. And the reports that they give immediately afterwards are so compelling that, like, their whole worldview is shifted, and I forget the guy's name, but the person who made the film was saying, like, this is a terrible business model because, like, either you take Prozac for your whole life, or like 2 pills is going to end your problem. And there's
Yeah.
no money to be made off of it. But I do find it absolutely fascinating, and I'm following very eagerly to see how it's going to develop. But I wonder, can I challenge the psychedelic experience from this actually comes from Dr. Jeffrey Long, who I interviewed a few months back, and he is a founder of a research institute that deals with near-death experience. He is not such a he believes that near-death experience is an authentic experience of the metaphysical, and that psychedelic experience he does not buy into so much. And he recommends going to a website called Erowid, EROWID, in which people recount their experiences. So I went there, and although I will say that a decent number of people seem to have these classical, metaphysical experiences with the love and the unity and all that, some of them are like, I crawled across the 9th dimension to do battle with gum bleeding, and my arm sprouted into an oak tree, and there were spiders, and I had to kill them.
Yeah, I've been
Some
there.
of them just seem like whacked, and I wonder if you can draw a distinction for us of why they're not more universal, if they really are an effective way of, quote unquote, tapping into this higher reality. Why are some of them just bizarre?
Well, like I say, there's a vast array of psychedelic experiences. Some of them you could classify as metaphysical in classical sense. Others, as I say, aesthetic. Others just funny. Many others bodily. Others, as you say, it's very common to meet entities. Um, so some of them are also offer psychological insights that you couldn't call hallucination. This is like Chris Leatherby's argument that even though a lot of it is hallucination, the psychological insights one can receive, can be extremely beneficial, a bit like what I just mentioned before. But I mean, I think it's not. It's perfectly logically valid to say that certain experiences are hallucinatory, whereas not all of them are. You know, just like you know, in general, certain perceptions turn out not to be the case. Like when you think you see a friend in a crowd or whatever, and some of them are. You know, that doesn't mean that all of perception therefore is hallucinatory or all of it is veridical. You can make nuanced distinctions, I think. And of course, I'm not saying it's important to realize that I'm not saying that a psychedelic experience proves in any way the reality of which that you're seeing. So just because you've had, although it sounds paradoxical, like a timeless experience, doesn't mean therefore reality is fundamentally timeless. However, it does give the question then becomes, well, how do we determine whether it's a hallucination or not? And then, well, then you get into metaphysics and you look at the sort of pros and cons of each theory and how they relate. And of course, these are deep questions that no one has sort of agreed upon or come to the end of. It's an ongoing discussion. But
What's your gut tell
the
you?
point is to say that it must be hallucination is
Mm-hmm.
dogmatic. I mean, there's no reason to say that. I mean, even with entities, I mean, there's certain, you know, doctors I know who believe in the reality of the entities one sees on, for example, ayahuasca, DMT. And of course, if you look at the reports of um, shamans, for example, in the Americas, in the Mesoamerica and whatever, you know, like seeing entities is a very common part of the experience. And of course, they have, well, not of course, but they generally have complete belief in the veridicality of those. I'm kind of agnostic about that. I'm not going to make the case one way or the other for the reality of the entities, but at the very least, it's very interesting that people do see entities not just in the West, but also in the Americas, and in fact worldwide. It's very strange that it's such a universal phenomenon. Considering, I mean, there's another argument which stems from mysticism, but also applies to psychedelic experience, which is whether there's a universal experience, like people like Aldous Huxley, William James argued for, or whether all experiences, all mystical and psychedelic experiences, which overlap but not the same, whether they are culturally conditioned. So not just the
Mm-hmm.
interpretation, but the actual experience itself. There's actually a Jewish scholar called Stephen Katz, in the late 1970s, argued that all mystical experiences, is culturally conditioned, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore it's not at all a universal, perennial philosophy as it's known on the other side. But of course, his arguments for that were not really based on evidence; they're based on speculation. So it's an interesting theory. Maybe the answer is somewhere in between. You know, so some of your life, some of your culture, some of your ideology and language comes into play when you have experiences under psychedelics, but at the same time, high enough dose, you have these incredibly alien experiences that are often said to be ineffable. In other words, you can't put them into words, and which seem completely alien to one's culture. So it's very hard to sort of accept that in all cases. But again, there's another very interesting discussion that is now being had with regard to this. It also, it also applies, of course, to the the therapeutic value of psychedelics. So there's so much work to be done, and so many questions unanswered. I mean, we've got this Bloomsbury book, Philosophy and Psychedelics, that has just come out, 15 chapters, like discussing different philosophical aspects of the psychedelic experience. We've got some modules, masters and undergraduate modules at Exeter teaching it. We've got a colloquium. We're going to conferences now throughout the year. So there's like an increasing interest in it. I think but a few years ago, well, 10 years ago, people said this is a career killer, don't go into that. But it's just so intrinsically interesting that I had to do it. And I think now loads of people are beginning to realize that it is intellectually viable. In fact, very, very important intellectually and culturally.
So, yeah, sorry, you wanted to say something else?
No, no, no. I'll keep it.
Okay. So, you said at the beginning, like, that science and philosophy are both trying to understand the nature of reality, right? Everybody, presumably, if they're thinking about things, it wants to know the nature of things, the way things are and what's going to happen and so on and so forth. Are you familiar with the work of Donald Hoffman by any chance?
I've heard of him, but I haven't read any of his stuff.
So it's great stuff, and he's got a great TED talk, and a bunch of good YouTube videos to look at as well. But basically, his main thesis is reality is quite different from how we're able to perceive it, and the perception is a convenience at best. And in order to illustrate that, I mean, he does it in a variety of ways, but one of the ways he goes into the concept of synesthesia. And I want to read you just one quick quote from that. This is a guy named Michael Watson who's talking to a neurologist, and he's just explaining his experience of spearmint. And he says, I feel a round shape. It's also very cool, so it has some sort of glass or stone material because of the temperature. What is wonderful is the absolute smoothness of it. The only thing I can explain this feeling as is it's a tall, smooth column of glass. So for most of us, obviously, spearmint has no association with a physical thing, but this guy literally feels things and very specific things when he eats or smells, I guess, spearmint. And obviously that's not the absolute nature of spearmint. And therefore the question is, are all of our perceptions along these lines, are that he says that our interface with reality is somewhat like a desktop on your computer. The desktop does not explain what is actually going on, which has to do with circuits and electricity and so on and so forth, but it's just a convenient way of interfacing with reality. And what the reality ultimately is, he would say, we don't yet know.
Mm.
How does that strike you?
Well, I mean, immediately makes me think of Kant's philosophy, the distinction between phenomena and noumena, which is that, for Kant, he argued that we experience the world in a particular human way because we project, as it were, our forms of experience like space and time and causality and the colors and sounds onto the given, onto what is reality. Now, that means that reality in itself, the thing in itself, noumena, is not like that. The mind-independent reality must be very different from the human way of perceiving it. And certainly, I mean, so this is, the start of modern philosophy, really, and certainly I accept that. At the same time, um, I do believe I am a realist, which means that following especially Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of prehension, when we perceive something, that perception is part both of that thing, as it were, and part of us. So it becomes a process, a sort of interactive process between subject and object. And it's that process that then, for us, from an intrinsic point of view, has a particular qual, like redness or the taste of spearmint or the shape of spearmint or whatever it may be. But of course, we humans probably differ from other animals in how we perceive reality. I mean, for a very basic example, time consciousness, we have a certain time rate. Probably other animals see time, which for us would be in slow motion or fast forward. There's no objective speed of time, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, John Locke in the 1600s, the English philosopher, he spoke about inverted qualia. That how do you know that my red is your red, right? There's
Right.
no way. Again, this shows the limitations of science. You cannot determine it empirically. You can't say that, look, these two brains, they have exactly the same patternation for red in the same places, therefore they must be identical. How do you know that the identical brain has the identical phenomenology? It can't. That's where the science is limited again. So it's an old view, and of course, Locke and Galileo and others, they spoke about primary and secondary qualities. So primary qualities they thought was three-dimensional space, and secondary qualities were colors and sounds and so on. They're human, they're not in reality in itself, but they believe the primary quality of space, the structural, spatial, temporal qualities of things were real. Kant came along and said, no, even those are human. However, that was partly based on Hume. Kant's philosophy was a reaction to Hume's problem of causality, that you can never perceive causality in itself. You just see things constantly conjoined. And then he said, causality therefore is a priori, and we project it. Problem with that is Whitehead says that Hume was wrong, because actually you can perceive causality, because the perception itself is causality. When you see the sun, that the perception of the sun is part of the sun. It's the causal process of the sun entering you, you see. So that makes Kant's whole theory redundant. However, of course, still, there is this subjective filter that we all have. But there's no... I think it's all, everything that exists is in the interaction between subjects and objects, or subjects and subjects ultimately, right? And each being, each perspective will have a different take on reality. So I would hold this kind of plural objectivity there, which of course again refers, like interestingly links to psychedelic experience. Synesthesia, for example, is very common, not very common, can be had with psychedelics. And I think it's not wrong, someone who hears colors and sees sounds, they're not wrong. It's just their way of perceiving it. And as long as you can navigate reality through that inverted qualia, it's fine. There's nothing harmful about it. It's only when it impedes your practical behavior that you might want to seek help. There's nothing intrinsically incorrect about it, is there?
I guess not. No, it's just it's just interesting that's. I just think it highlights the nature of perception and how it can be somewhat unlike. How we would expect it, and therefore it raises the question: are we perceiving the actual thing, or some facsimile of it, like but still the point is that I don't know if I can. I would like to get at the ultimate. I want to know what's underlying everything, and to come to be able to connect with that is like an ultimate goal.
Mio DMT. There's your solution. I'm joking.
Well, some people would say that, and it's something to keep in mind. I'm right.
It'll give you another perspective, at least. That's a very potent psychedelic 5-MeO DMT, and it gives you the ultimate unitive experience. But it's very dangerous, and I do not recommend anyone take it.
It's good to know.
It can be very scary. However, it's very insightful as well. But don't take it.
We have time for 2.5 more questions before we hit the mark. Yeah. Let me just ask you quickly. I said I wasn't going to ask you a personal question, but maybe it's a little bit personal. You're in the philosophy business, I'm curious about your motivation. Like, when you do this research and when you read all the books that you read, is it that it's fascinating to you, and you love the intellectual challenge and play of the whole thing, or do you feel like you're digging towards an answer? Like, do you feel like you're going to arrive someplace? Do you have a goal in mind, or is it just like, whatever comes my way, I'm going to entertain, and it's just great, great stuff to be involved with?
I think the road is very fun to drive, but at the same time, I'm driving towards an end, an ideal, which
can you articulate what that is?
Well, I suppose it's ultimately relates to the mind-matter mystery. What is the relation? This is what I'm really interested in, the hard realm of consciousness. Maybe it's not solvable. This is Colin McGinn's view, for example. But I think there's a missing. At the moment, I'm much more inclined towards a kind of panpsychological point of view, that mind is much more common than we think, which is just more parsimonious and based on logic, not on mere faith or anything like this. I think that's closer to the truth, but there are still a lot of problems. How could it be that? What is the criterion for something to be a subjective unit? A big problem. Why is it that something that seems so distinct, for example, neurons in the brain and their activity, and let's say the feeling of curiosity, or how can they be the same thing? Even the question, okay, there are different perspectives on the same thing, but how do we determine that? How do we go down and understand the full reality of each one, so that we realize that they ultimately are the same thing. We, we it's just an argument from parsimony, really, that they should be the same thing, but we haven't actually traced the development, the unity. So I suppose that's my main end. The fun in the drive is looking at these different theories, looking at how every single one of them has got major problems. There's no denying that. But also, I think there's an aesthetic element to it. There's kind of when one writes philosophy, one is writing a composition ultimately, and composition follows laws of aesthetics, just as paintings do, musical compositions do as well. So there's that
Yes.
element to it as well, which I appreciate. And of course, psychedelic phenomenology is intrinsically fascinating, and also just finding out how things kind of generally fit together, very interesting as well. I mean, I suppose it's just a really fascinating subject, and the goal
Yep.
is ultimately very important. But of course, yeah, it's still abstract.
Let me, in the 4 minutes that we have remaining, I know you're familiar with the work of Dr. Rick Strassman, who has worked extensively with DMT, and he wrote a book called DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, among other works. And I just want to quote from that really quickly. He says, "To the extent that prophecy and the DMT state share features, the Hebrew Bible, interestingly, may provide valuable guidelines for those wishing to optimize the spiritual potential of their work with psychedelic substances. By learning about the way the text views the nature of prophecy and who attains it and how, people may use this information to make their psychedelic experiences more prophetic." I'm just curious, from a guy who is an expert in this subject as well, what do you make of that? Do you think he's like, it's a little exotic that he's connecting it with the Hebrew Bible? Do you believe in prophecy? Do you hear what he's saying, or do you think this is one guy's interesting take on it?
I've had a few email conversations with Rick Strassman relating to this, actually, and I've just got his new book, Psychedelic Handbook, as it happens. And in it, there's a bit of so-called medieval metaphysics, where he sort of alludes to Aristotle and the tradition there. With regard to the biblical, the theoneurology, or was it neurotheology that
He says both. Yeah.
okay, in that book. It's not my field, but I'll say this. I am very interested in Spinoza's philosophy, and I did write an essay on Spinoza's metaphysics in relation to psychedelic experience in that book I mentioned. And interestingly, Spinoza, he was Sephardim.
Apostate.
He was excommunicated by his fellow Jews in Amsterdam at the time, 1600s, and then his books were banned by the church for 100 years and so on. But he tries to bring in a number of biblical passages into his understanding of reality, and he bases that on other Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, especially. And he at the end of Spinoza's book, The Ethics, his main work, he sounded like a pretty much almost like a material. Well, he's a monist. Mind and body are the same thing. That's why Einstein loved Spinoza. He said that he's the most important of all modern philosophers because he makes soul and body the same thing, right? But Spinoza also believes in the infinite intellect, which is like the mind of the universe, mind of God, eternal consciousness, and so on. And at the end of the Ethics, when he was sort of making this monism, he says there's no soul distinct from the body, but he says, but death is not the end. And then he talks about this thing called the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis, and in it he mentions the I forgot what it was now, but the Hebrew term for glory in the Old Testament, and
Hod.
Said, yeah, that's it. And he says this intellectual love of God is this is what is meant by glory in the Old Testament. And I did look. I know that Strassman has looked at this a little bit as well, and although Strassman's quite critical of Spinoza, whereas I'm kind of quite enthusiastic about him, so we differ on our takes. But there's an interesting link to the Old Testament, which it's one of those things on my list I need to look more into, really.
Okay, and the half a question that remains. Your bio says that a Marvel character is named after you, or is based on you. Can you explain how that came about?
Yeah, in my first book, Pneumanautics, there's a chapter called Neo-Nihilism, and where I'm arguing for the that values are subjective and plural rather than objective and single. And this influenced Warren Ellis, who's a comic book writer. He wrote a number of comic books, Iron Man 3, and so on. I'd never heard of him until then, but he then wrote. He was tasked by Marvel to recreate this character in the Inhumans family, I think, called Karnak, and he based it partly on that essay that I'd written that he'd happened to just read at the opportune moment. Anyway, so there's a small influence of me in that comic book hero, but I've milked it as much as I can. So quite happy it happened.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I wanted to get into a whole bunch of other things, including pantheism, but we'll have to save it for another time, or maybe some essays down the road. I think that would be fascinating. I think your work is great, and I really like the way that you deliver it. And so I hope that you keep it up and teach people these great matters. And thank you again for being here. And for everybody who's watching, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share, and stay abreast of all the great things that we have coming up on aish.com/philosophy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Adam. Much gratitude. I love your program beyond belief. I'm honored to be on it.
Thank you.